The market of Meraxis never slept. It breathed smoke and neon and betrayal with every flickering sign and every whispered deal deep in the underbelly of the station where sunlight had never touched and honor was just another thing you could trade. If you were desperate enough, Kael Thorne walked with his hands in his pockets and his eyes down, scanning stalls cluttered with rusted components, expired rations, black market meds, and enough stolen tech to light a colony. He wasn't here to shop. He was here to disappear, or at least pretend that he hadn't once been someone who mattered. He turned a corner, ducked under a leaking pipe, and paused. Something had shifted in the air. Not the smell, not the sound, but something quieter, like the way a room feels just before someone says your name. The stall was small, shadowed unmarked, a canvas drape hung half open like an invitation or a trap. Inside stood a cage. Not a large one, just big enough for something to huddle inside. And she did. At first, Kael thought she was some kind of exotic pet, a rare biogenetic crossbreed. Her skin shimmered faintly like pearl beneath dust, her limbs folded too neatly, her hair long silver tangled around her knees. But then she looked up and he stopped breathing. Her eyes were not animal, not broken, not begging. They were still, too still, like something waiting for the world to end. She didn't speak, didn't flinch, just watched him as if she already knew what he would decide before he did. A low laugh rasped from behind the curtain, and a man emerged, half flesh, half machine, metal jaw clicking with every word. "You got good eyes, friend. Most walk past her like she's scrap, but you see it, don't you?" Kael didn't answer. He couldn't. The man grinned, smoke curling from between his teeth. "She's got no name. No records came in with a wreck we picked over in the outer belt. No pulse when we found her, but then she woke up staring like that, breathing like nothing happened." Kael glanced back at her. Still no movement. Still those eyes. The man leaned closer. "She's not tech. Not quite. Not flesh either. I ran every scan, burned through a dozen readers. They all say the same thing." What he grinned wider. "She's empty," Kael narrowed his eyes. "That's not what I see." The man shrugged, then spread his hands. "Make me an offer, or move along." Kael stepped forward, slowly crouched before the cage, his fingers brushing the edge of the lock. "Why are you still alive?" The girl blinked once. Then she spoke, her voice soft but certain. "Because I haven't given it away yet." Kael stared, and something inside him cracked open. He stood, tossed a cred chip toward the merchant without checking the balance. "She's mine now." The man cackled but didn't argue. Kael opened the cage. The girl didn't move until he reached out his hand, and even then she only hesitated for a breath before taking it. Her palm was warm despite everything. And as they walked away past stalls and lights and greed, Kael felt it. For the first time in years, something was about to begin. The corridors of Meraxis narrowed the deeper Kael went, ceilings dropped lower, lights flickered, less like stars, more like dying embers. This was where people came to vanish, to smuggle, to forget. Kael led her through a rusted maintenance shaft that exited behind a shuttered fuel bay. The girl followed without a word, her bare feet silent against the metal, her silver hair clinging to her back, damp from recycled air. She hadn't asked where they were going. She hadn't asked why he took her. That unsettled him more than if she had screamed. He stopped near a service hatch and pried it open. With his multi-tool inside was a room barely wider than a cargo crate, lined with discarded filters and cracked canisters. Kael ducked inside and gestured for her to follow. "We stay here tonight. No one scans these walls and no one comes looking unless they're already dead." She stepped in quietly, sat in the corner. Legs folded, arms around her knees, the glow from her skin dimmed to a faint shimmer. Barely enough to light the shadows, Kael watched her from across the room, leaned back against the opposite wall. His pack between them and silence thick in the air. "You got a name?" he asked finally. She didn't look up. "Not one I remember." He tilted his head. "Not remember or not allowed to say." Stillness. Then she whispered, "Alira." Kael nodded slowly. "Good name, it's not mine," she added quickly. "Not really. Then whose is it?" She met his eyes for the first time since they left the market. "It belonged to someone who died before I was made." Kael blinked, tried to piece the sentence together. You were made. She nodded once, the glow in her eyes pulsing like a heartbeat. Grown in a pod encoded from a seed of someone long lost, not to replace them. Not exactly, but to carry what they couldn't keep. Kael exhaled, slow and quiet. Clones were rare these days, outlawed in half the core sectors and hunted in the other half. You're carrying something important, aren't you? Alira hesitated, then raised her left hand. At first, Kael saw nothing, then light bloomed beneath the skin veins of soft violet and gold, flickering across her wrist like circuitry alive with memory. I'm not just data, she said. I'm a living archive. A map woven into thought, encrypted in emotion. The memories of a people that no longer exist. He stared not at the light, but at her. And you don't even know what's inside. Only fragments, images, sounds, voices I've never heard with a mouth that wasn't mine. Kael rubbed the back of his neck. And the bastards back at the market, they had no idea. She shook her head softly. They didn't know what I was, only that I wasn't theirs. The air grew heavy again, not with fear, but with something older, responsibility. Kael didn't say anything for a long while. Then finally he spoke. I didn't mean to save something this big. She looked at him. Would you have left me if you had known? He met her gaze. No, then maybe you were supposed to find me before you knew what I was. They sat in silence after that, the light from her skin fading as she drifted to sleep, head resting against the wall, knees pulled tight. Kael stayed awake, watching the shadows shift across the cracked floor, wondering what kind of galaxy would hunt something so small, and what kind of man he would have to become to protect her. Meraxis had many names. To the law, it was an unregulated shipping port. To the desperate, it was sanctuary. And to those like Kael, it was a scar on the galaxy's face. A beautiful broken place where debts lived longer than people, and kings were made from silence and fear. The smuggler king ruled from a tower of rust and chrome bolted into the spine of the station. His name wasn't known anymore, just his reach, the kind that could get you anywhere, or get you killed trying. Kael stood at the entrance of that tower now, Alira beside him, cloaked in a long coat. Her glow hidden her steps, too quiet for this place. She shouldn't be here, neither should he. But the last 3 bounty droids had all scanned his ship before exploding, and that meant someone had already marked him for what he carried. They needed a ghost route, and only the king gave Ghost permission to move. The lift creaked as it carried them up past old vents and broken glass, until the doors opened into red light and gold trim, a room wide and warm like a predator's smile. He sat on a throne made from old engines, a crown of navigation wires across his brow. His voice smooth and rich like poison aged in velvet. Kael Thorne, he said with a smirk, did not think I'd see your face again without a price on it. You will, Kael said flatly. Give it time. The king laughed and leaned forward, eyeing Alira beside him. And what's this? An offering, a gift, or a trade? Alira said nothing, her face calm, her hood still up, but Kael stepped forward a little. She's under my protection. Everything is under someone's protection, the king said, until it's not. He stood slowly, circled them, once then, twice his presence. A force of gravity, a man who knew what things were worth just by how they looked. When afraid, I need a route. Kael said fast, clean off the Dominion grids. Something strong enough to carry heat without melting? And what do you offer for that little favor? Kael hesitated, then held up a small chip info cache from a Dominion salvage drone fully intact. The king took it, examined it, and smiled. This would get you a corridor to the edge of the void. Maybe more, but that's not what I want. He turned to Alira. I want her. Kael stepped forward. Not for sale. The king raised a brow. Everything here is for sale. Even silence. Even time. Kael met his gaze steady. Not her. The room cooled by a fraction, the tension shifting like a tide. Finally, the king laughed again, stepped back and waved his hand. Fine, fine, you keep your ghost, girl. But if I'm giving you a quarter, I want something else. What, there's a crate in bay, 7 locked for years. No one can crack it. I want what's inside, and I want it without it. Screaming. Kael frowned. What is it? The king smiled. I don't ask that question, and neither will you. Kael nodded. Fine, you do this, he said, eyes glittering. And I give you a corridor, no scans, no questions, and no bounty hunters for at least a week. As they left, Alira finally spoke. He wanted to claim me. She said not to own me, but to hide me. Kael nodded. Yeah, and I think he knew exactly what you are. She looked up at him, her voice quiet. Then we better finish this fast before someone, smarter than him, tries again. He looked at her and didn't say it, but thought it anyway. He wasn't going to let anyone claim her, not while he was still breathing. The crate sat in Bay 7 alone, silent, wrapped in old alloy bands, scorched from time and impact. It was tucked behind shattered cargo containers and inactive loading bots, its surface unmarked, except for one sigil. Kael stared at it, arms folded, brow. Tight, this thing's older than my ship, he muttered. Maybe older than the station. Alira stood beside him, her coat pulled tighter around her shoulders though the air was warm. Her fingers flexed slowly like she was sensing something without touch. It's humming, she said, but not audibly. Not for you. Kael raised a brow and stepped closer. Got any guesses? She hesitated. It's not a weapon. Not exactly, it's biological, coated with layered consciousness, like a fragmented entity held in stasis. Kael looked at her. You're saying there's something alive in there? Not alive like you understand it, she replied, and then more quietly. I think it's calling to me. Before he could stop her, she stepped forward, her hand brushing the side of the crate, and the world cracked open. The lights flickered, the floor vibrated, and Kael felt a surge of heat flood the room like fire moving under his skin. Alira gasped and fell to her knees. Eyes wide, glowing bright veins of golden light surged through her arms across her neck. Her voice trembled as she whispered, It's binding to me. Kael dropped beside her, caught her shoulders, but her body was burning hot, too hot. Alira, what's happening? It's sinking, she gasped. It's using my core to reawaken itself too fast, too much. I can't. A pulse of light burst from her chest, knocking Kael back. The crate snapped open, its seal breaking with a sound like tearing gravity, and a cloud of silver particles poured into the air, swirling toward her, pulled like metal to magnet. Kael reached for his blaster but stopped because the particles didn't attack. They wrapped around her, cocooned her in radiant filaments. Her skin shimmered with layers of unfamiliar markings, as if someone else's memories were being carved into her in real time. And then she screamed. Kael lunged forward, held her tight, whispering her name again and again as the storm of light poured into her. The room filled with sound and then silence. Alira collapsed against him, limp breath, shallow, her skin now covered in thin glowing patterns like constellations, her voice barely a whisper. It showed me everything. Kael held her tighter. What did you see? A door, she said, between worlds. Something ancient, something waiting. And they know now who the one's hunting me, she said, eyes fluttering open. That crate wasn't just a vault, it was a beacon. Kael stood up fast, eyes scanning the bay, already expecting to see something. Something worse than the king. And he was right. From the far corridor came the sound of boots. Not mercenaries, military, armored train. The Dominion, Kael cursed under his breath, lifted Alira and ran ducking through side halls behind fuel tanks, leaping over fallen scaffolding as alarms started to blare across the station. He could hear voices tracking them, triangulating. He could hear his own blood pounding louder with each step. But most of all, he could hear her whispering through the static of pain. You should have left me. He looked down at her eyes, fierce, even in weakness. Not a chance. As the corridor twisted into darkness behind them, the last thing they saw before the door slammed shut was a Dominion officer reaching down and touching the crate. His face went white, and then he screamed. The fire had chosen Alira, and no one else could bear it. The vents above reactor wing, 12 coughed smoke into a corridor lined with burnt-out lights. Kael moved fast, carrying Alira over his shoulder, ducking under hanging wires, stepping through puddles that hissed as if even water had started to rot in this place. They had made it off the upper bay. Barely. The Dominion troopers were swarming now, deploying seeker drones and sniffers and other quiet things that never missed their mark. Kael kicked open a maintenance hatch and dropped into the undercrawl, barely wide enough for his body. He slid her down beside him, then sealed the hatch behind them. Total dark except for the faint shimmer of Alira's breath. He waited until the pain left her face, until the air calmed. Then he asked, "What the hell was that?" Her voice came slowly quiet, not because of weakness, but because words could no longer catch up to what she carried. That wasn't just a beacon, it was a gate, a fragment of something older than planets. And I wasn't just synced to it, I am part of it. Kael looked at her eyes locked even in the gloom. "You knew," she shook her head. "I knew I was made to carry something, but not like that. Not something alive, not something buried." Kael leaned back, resting against the cold metal of the wall, his breath shaking slightly. "You're saying this isn't just memory or maps or tech. It's a presence," she whispered. "It thinks it waits and it chose me." Silence passed between them like a question neither could ask out loud. Then Kael opened the panel to a side grate, kicked it open and crawled forward. "Where are we going? A place no one scans anymore." He muttered, "A ship graveyard. 3 levels down. There's a vault they used to use for burnt biotech testbeds too. Unstable to move," Perfect Alira said softly. They dropped down through collapsing vents, slipped past a broken scanner whose lens was fogged with age, and finally reached a chamber buried beneath decks long since written off by the station AI. Inside were bones, not human, not quite alien either, curved rib cages long as Kael's body, stone-like skin cracked open as if something had bloomed and vanished. Alira stepped closer to the largest skeleton, knelt beside its skull, and touched the side gently. "Their name was Nalari," she said once. "Protectors of memory, each carried the mind of a world, and when the world died, they went silent. Until now," Kael crossed his arms, leaned on the wall and watched. "And you're the first one since the collapse." "Yes," she turned to him, and her expression was no longer uncertain. "I don't think I was made to store memory. I think I was made to bring it back." She pressed her palm to the ground. The symbols on her skin lit faintly, and a glowing trail traced itself along the floor, forming a perfect mirrored spiral. It matched the ribs, matched the walls, matched the stars they passed on the way here. Kael blinked. "That's a star chart, it's more," she said. "It's a recall key." He stared, then laughed once, low and half bitter. "And now the Dominion knows you have it?" She stood slowly, her body still trembling. "Then we don't run anymore." "We find the rest of it before they do." Kael nodded. "You're not alone in this." Alira tilted her head slightly as if hearing something only she could understand. "I never was. Outside in the depths of the station, scanners pinged again and again. But each time they reached for her, they were burned because she no longer held fire. She had become it. They reached the edge of Merax's station under a false sky, where the plating had long since cracked open, revealing black beyond black and broken ships suspended like corpses in a frozen graveyard. Kael stood on the edge of an old gantry overlooking the wreck of a war cruiser split in half. The number 09 Cerberus still painted in scorched lettering across the hull. It hung crooked between 2 maintenance towers like a bridge to nowhere. "That's it," he muttered. "The gate's in there." Alira stepped beside him, her coat now pulled back, her skin glowing openly, the markings along her arms and neck brightening as they neared the wreckage, each symbol humming a little louder in the silence. She didn't need maps anymore. Her body remembered. They crossed through the ruins, silent, no alarms, no patrols. This part of the station was quarantined after the reactor meltdown years ago. No one came here, not even the scavengers, but the air didn't feel dead. It felt patient. The door to the cruiser was open, half torn, the metal warped from heat. Kael climbed in first flashlight, sweeping across blackened walls and crushed panels, then helped Alira through her bare fingers, brushing the hull as she entered. The metal pulsed faintly beneath her touch. They moved down a slanted corridor past empty cryopods and shattered display screens, then deeper into the ship until they found a chamber with no windows, no lights, just a curved wall of alien stone built into the very frame of the human vessel. The gate. Alira walked toward it slowly, her feet bare now, her voice low. "This isn't a structure, it's a seed planted in every advanced race since the first collapse. Waiting for someone who remembered without knowing." She stepped to the center and knelt. pressed her palms to the ground. The floor lit up instantly, golden lines racing outward in fractals. The gate began to glow. Kael stepped back, shielding his eyes. "You sure this is going to work?" "No," she said, smiling slightly, "but I know it's right." Then the Dominion arrived. A blast rocked the far end of the corridor. Red lights flared. Enemy soldiers poured in, weapons drawn. Kael grabbed his blaster and fired a covering shot as they ducked behind fallen beams. Alira didn't move. She stayed kneeling as if nothing around her mattered except the sound within the stone. "Go," Kael shouted. "Take cover." "I can't," she whispered. "If I move, it stops." He turned, eyes wild. "Then I stay." He stepped between her and the incoming fire, returning shots covering her with every last clip of ammo he had around hit his shoulder. He grunted, dropped to one knee but didn't fall. Not this time, not for her. The gate surged behind them, light pouring from its core symbols, spiraling through the air like stardust. Kael turned to see Alira standing now, floating slightly, her body aglow, her voice deeper than sound. "You will not stop what was begun before your empires were dust." She reached out, touched Kael's chest, and pushed. He fell back just as the gate pulled him through, gone in a flash of white. The last thing he saw was her smile and her turning toward the enemy, unafraid. Then the gate sealed, and silence returned. Kael fell through a tunnel of light that had no walls, no gravity, only sensation like sound, without noise, a storm without wind, and then silence like the world had inhaled and never exhaled again. He landed hard, but not on metal, not on dirt, on grass, real grass. Soft golden fields stretched in every direction under a lavender sky, with two suns rising over the edge of the horizon, casting long shadows that moved like memory. He sat up slowly, heart racing, breath, ragged staring. It wasn't Meraxus. It wasn't any star system he knew, but it felt familiar, like a place you dreamt of before being born. Then he heard her voice. "You made it." He turned, and there she was, Alira, alive but different. She stood barefoot in the grass, wearing a simple robe of woven light. Her skin still shimmered, but not from energy, from peace. Her eyes no longer braced for survival. They were calm and endless. "Where are we?" Kael asked quietly. "The core of the seed," she answered, the memory filled. "Where my people stored what was too precious to lose a world between time. Where thought becomes landscape, where names become roots." He looked around at the endless horizon. "So this is the map?" "No," she smiled. "This is the reason the map was made." She sat beside him, her hand brushing his. "When the gate closed, it separated us from the war, from the hunger, from those who would take. But it didn't destroy them. It just locked them out." "And what now?" he asked. "Now we build again." Kael leaned back against the warm earth, looking up at a sky that didn't hurt. "You could have stayed behind, fought them all. I did. And I won, not by killing, but by choosing a future they couldn't follow." He turned to her. "Why did you bring me with you?" She didn't answer with words. She placed his hand over her heart and let him feel it. The rhythm of something new. Not code, not power, but belonging. "You saved me when I didn't know what I was worth," she whispered. "And when I learned what I carried, you never stepped back." "Because you were never a weapon," Kael said softly. "You were home." They sat like that until the stars blinked awake in the soft twilight of a world reborn, and above them the last remnants of an ancient message whispered through the grass. Not all fire is meant to burn, some is meant to light the way. The wind moved softly through the golden grass of the valley, each blade swaying like a breath too old to remember and too gentle to forget. Kael stood near the edge of a quiet stream, the water clear as glass reflecting twin suns that never scorched, only warmed. He no longer wore armor, no weapons, no need. He had traded war for silence, traded noise for presence. Behind him, the structure they built still stood, not made of steel or stone, but woven from strands of memory, solid and soft. Like something grown, not constructed, it was more than shelter. It was story, a place that remembered them, even as they continued to remember each other. Alira approached without sound, her bare feet silent against the earth. Her Her silver hair caught the light, her eyes bright with peace but never dull with certainty. She reached for his hand, and he gave it to her, without pause, without thought, without fear. Their fingers laced slowly like roots, finding each other in warm soil. "It has been 1 year," she said, "since we left the gate behind, and yet Kael said it feels like we never belonged to anything else." They walked together along the bank, the world quiet but not empty, the kind of quiet filled with choice. Alira stopped and looked up at the sky, where a constellation blinked into place above them, one of the many patterns only she could name. "They are still out there," she said, not with fear but with fact. "They will keep searching for what I was." "Let them," Kael replied, "because what you are now is not something they can catch." She smiled and leaned her head against his shoulder. "I was born as a carrier of memory. Now I am just someone who remembers what it means to be loved." Kael didn't answer with words. He turned and kissed her softly, without ceremony, without reason. Because in this world they no longer needed reasons. Later, as the stars returned and the night sky bloomed across the sky, like a painting finally finished, they sat beside the fire outside their home, her hand still in his heartbeat steady. Kael whispered, "Do you ever miss what we left behind?" Alira nodded slowly. "Sometimes, but only when I forget how much I have found in your silence." They sat like that for a long time, not waiting, not hiding, just being together. And when the fire dimmed and they stood to go back inside, Kael reached out blindly into the dark and found her hand already waiting. "If you found someone the world cast away, would you fight for them, even if you did not understand them? Would you hold on when everything else told you to let go? Share your thoughts below and tell us what you would have done if you were Kael."